The sound of his shoes hitting the hardwood floor was quiet, purposeful, each step masked by the soft murmurs of laughter filtering from the living room. Thomas paused in the entryway, his gaze fixed on the scattered pairs of unfamiliar shoes, each one an unmistakable mark of another man's presence in his home. He took a slow, controlled breath, feeling the weight of betrayal settle deeper in his chest, a familiar sting now dulled by the resolve he had steeled over the past few hours. He loosened his collar, the fabric barely constraining the undercurrent of tension beneath his calm exterior. The laughter, punctuated by his wife's warm, lilting tone, reached him clearly from beyond the half-closed door to the living room. He moved closer, remaining in the shadows, surveying the scene with cold precision. Lila, poised as ever, was laughing softly, leaning toward one of the men, as though she hadn't a care in the world. For a moment, Thomas allowed himself to feel the ironic satisfaction of her obliviousness, watching her indulge in the web she had so carefully spun. She was unaware of his presence, unaware of the calm storm that stood just feet away, waiting for the moment to shatter the fragile world she had built on deceit. With a quiet step, he crossed the threshold into the light. The laughter faltered, and 3 pairs of eyes turned to him in stunned silence. Thomas lingered in the doorway, taking in the scene before him, a tableau of comfort and intimacy that once belonged to him, now twisted into a stranger's gathering in his own home. His gaze fell on Lila, who was frozen mid-laugh, her face shifting from surprise to barely masked guilt as she took in his unexpected presence. Beside her, the 2 men sat stiffly, their relaxed postures now gone, replaced by the tense unease of men caught trespassing where they were not welcome. "Gentlemen," Thomas greeted, his voice smooth, controlled, betraying none of the fury simmering beneath. "It seems I've come home just in time." One of the men, a tall, dark-haired figure who looked too young to be here, too confident to be concerned, cleared his throat and attempted a feeble smile, as though hoping to charm his way out of the discomfort. "We weren't expecting you back so soon," he stammered. "No, I imagine you weren't," Thomas replied coolly, his eyes now fixed on Lila. She sat upright, her carefully crafted composure beginning to fracture under the weight of his stare. Her cheeks flushed, and she instinctively glanced down, avoiding his gaze. "Lila," he continued, each word deliberate, slicing through the room's stifling silence, "I had no idea you had company tonight." She opened her mouth, perhaps to spin a convenient excuse, but no words came. The silence was filled with unspoken words, a chasm of secrets widening between them. She seemed to shrink under his gaze, visibly retreating from the confident, poised woman he'd once admired. And in that moment, the reality of her betrayal hit her, the cracks in her carefully woven story splintering into something ugly and exposed. "I cut my trip short," he explained, still addressing her, yet letting his words hover in the space shared by her lovers. "I thought it'd be a nice surprise. After all, it's rare we get to spend time together." The slight emphasis on together lingered in the air, and Thomas's lips twisted in a small, almost imperceptible smile, a glimmer of satisfaction as he watched her face pale. The second man, visibly older and more shaken, shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the doorway as if considering an escape. But Thomas had strategically positioned himself between them and the only exit, blocking any attempt to slink away. He had no intention of letting them slip out quietly. "Why don't we have a seat?" he offered, gesturing to the space beside Lila on the couch, his voice still level, polite even. "I think we have a few things to discuss." There was a pause as the 2 men hesitated, then grudgingly settled back down, their previous ease now a brittle facade, as they waited, unsure what to expect. Lila shifted on the couch, her eyes darting to each of her lovers in turn, but neither seemed willing to look at her. Finally, she raised her chin, attempting to regain her composure, but the fear lurking in her gaze was undeniable. Thomas took his time, moving around the room with slow, deliberate steps, inspecting each detail, as though seeing it all for the first time. The wine glasses, the scattered cards, the remnants of an evening meant for deception, they were all pieces of the betrayal unfolding around him. He let his fingers trail along the back of the couch, his hand resting just behind Lila's shoulder, close enough that she could feel the cold distance he now held between them. "So," he said, breaking the silence with a tone that was dangerously calm, "how long has this arrangement been going on?" The question hung in the air, and Lila visibly flinched, her eyes flickering with a brief, desperate look as though searching for a lifeline. But no help would come from her silent companions, who sat tensely, aware that this was not a conversation from which they could walk away unscathed. With every second that passed, the weight of her silence grew heavier, and Thomas allowed himself to savor the fear that had settled in her eyes. He had given her a chance to answer, and with her failure to respond, she had chosen her fate. Thomas moved closer, the tension thickening as he positioned himself directly in front of Lila, his shadow casting her in darkness. She was barely breathing, caught in a net of her own making, and he could see the subtle quiver in her hand as she gripped the edge of the couch. For years she had played this part well, the perfect wife, the charming hostess, but now the mask had cracked, and he was going to peel it away piece by piece. "Lila," he began, his voice a measured calm that belied the storm beneath. "I trusted you. Every day I left, I trusted that you would be here, that this house, our life, was secure." He let the words linger, each one landing with a pointed precision. "It's strange, though," he continued, glancing around at the empty wine bottles and disheveled throw pillows, "how different everything seems when you're not expecting an audience." He turned to the two men, studying them one by one. "And you both," he said, his voice turning even softer, somehow more menacing in its gentleness, "do you know each other?" Did she mention that she wasn't exclusive? A flicker of embarrassment crossed their faces. The dawning realization that each of them wasn't her only secret, only one thread in the tangled web she had spun. The younger man shifted uncomfortably, a faint look of shock dawning in his eyes, as though he were only now realizing the extent of his own folly. The older one remained tense, eyes cast downward, his face pale. Thomas moved to the fireplace, his hand grazing the picture frame of their last family vacation, a reminder of the life they had once shared. He lifted the frame slightly, angling it toward Lila, forcing her to look at it. "Do you remember this?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You were laughing. Happy, I thought. It seems my definition of happiness was naive." Lila's eyes filled with unshed tears, and she opened her mouth as if to speak, but Thomas cut her off, shaking his head slowly. "Don't lie. I think we're past that now." He turned back to the men, his gaze sharpening. "You both were willing to come into my home, uninvited, deceived just as I was. I hope you now see the kind of loyalty she offers. You're not special, just convenient." A strained silence filled the room, punctuated only by the quiet ticking of the clock, each passing second an accusation. The men exchanged a quick, uneasy glance, the gravity of their own involvement settling over them, heavy and undeniable. Finally, Lila, swallowing hard, whispered, "Thomas, I can explain." But her voice faltered under the weight of her guilt, and she knew that no explanation would be enough. There was no reasoning away the layers of betrayal she had laid upon him. Thomas's expression remained impassive, his gaze piercing as he tilted his head slightly. "Explain?" he repeated, almost amused. "I don't think an explanation is what's needed here, Lila. What you owe is the truth, however ugly, however inconvenient." He let his words sink in, watching as her shoulders slumped, her face blanching with realization. Turning to the men, he offered a faint, mirthless smile. "I think it's time for you to leave." His tone was calm, almost courteous, but the edge was unmistakable, an invitation laced with an unspoken threat. Without a word, the men rose, each one casting a quick, ashamed look at the woman they'd thought they knew. One of them, perhaps to save face, tried to meet Thomas's gaze but quickly dropped his eyes as he brushed past, vanishing from the room like a shadow. The front door clicked shut, leaving Thomas and Lila alone in the silence, the weight of her betrayal settling heavily between them. For a moment, he said nothing, letting her sit in the raw aftermath, the quiet finally stripping away her last defenses. The door clicked shut, leaving the silence thick and oppressive. Thomas stood across from Lila, arms crossed, his expression composed but his eyes cold, a study in restraint. Lila sat stiffly on the couch, hands twisting in her lap, her elegant facade visibly crumbling as she struggled to meet his gaze. "So," he began quietly, "I believe you said you could explain." His words were almost gentle, but each one landed with the weight of judgment, and she flinched, a barely perceptible tremor passing over her. "Go ahead, Lila," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me why I came home to find my wife laughing with strangers in our living room. Explain why I came home to this." He gestured around the room, taking in the remnants of her careless evening. She drew a shaky breath, casting about as if searching for the right words, something that might make him understand. "Thomas," she began, her voice fragile, "I didn't plan for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." Her hands gripped the edge of the couch, as though it could steady her, but her words were already failing, crumbling under the weight of her own guilt. It got complicated." "Complicated." He repeated the word slowly, almost tasting it, as if it were a concept he was trying to understand. I suppose you're right. Keeping up a double life, balancing two men behind your husband's back, that would be complicated. His voice was even, cool, each word calculated to dismantle her excuses. Her eyes filled with unshed tears, and she made a weak attempt to defend herself. I didn't think it would go this far. I thought I could keep it separate, that you'd never find out. The words spilled out, and she realized, even as she said them, how hollow they sounded, the shallowness of her justification, filling the space between them like poison. Thomas looked at her, his silence unbroken. There was no rage in his eyes, no accusations thrown in anger, only the cold, unforgiving clarity of someone who had seen through her entirely. He leaned forward, his gaze pinning her in place. So that's what I am then? Just someone you can hide things from? Someone you thought you could keep in the dark indefinitely? Thomas, please, she whispered, her voice cracking, the tears threatening to spill over. I never wanted to lose you. His expression remained unmoved. Lose me? You lost me the moment you chose to live this way, Lila. You made that decision the first time you let another man into this house, into our lives. The only difference now is that I know the truth. Lila's face twisted in anguish, and she reached out, as if a desperate touch might bridge the chasm between them. But Thomas leaned back, carefully out of reach, his body language signaling a finality that crushed any hope she clung to. Tell me, Lila, he said, his voice almost too soft to hear, when you laughed with them, did you think of me? When you entertained them here, in my home, were you hoping I'd never come back to see this? He paused, letting the silence press in around them, and he saw the shame flare in her expression as her eyes dropped to the floor. Or was it that I didn't matter at all? Her tears finally fell, but he watched them with no sympathy, as though they were merely proof of her regret. Too little and far too late. She covered her face with trembling hands, unable to meet his gaze. I thought I could balance it all, she choked out, her words broken. I thought maybe I could find some happiness. I didn't want to hurt you, but I wanted more. And her voice trailed off, the confession falling apart as she realized how hollow it sounded against his unyielding silence. You wanted more, he echoed, his voice barely more than a whisper. And you didn't mind what it cost. She shook her head, sobbing now as the weight of her choices bore down on her. But Thomas simply watched her with the cold detachment of someone who had already made his decision. For him, the tears and pleas were only shadows, an attempt to grasp what she had thrown away so carelessly. Lila, he said, finally breaking the silence, his voice as steady and calm as ever, it's time you face what you've done. You were willing to gamble everything I gave you for something fleeting. He shook his head, a hint of sadness creeping into his voice, though his eyes remained distant, detached. But there's no going back. Not now. And with that, he rose to his feet, leaving her to the silence she had created. Thomas stood silently, watching Lila's tear-streaked face as she struggled to compose herself, but there was no flicker of sympathy in his expression. In that moment he realized that the life they had shared, the years of companionship and trust, had already slipped away, replaced by this hollow aftermath of betrayal. Lila's pleas, her explanations, they were nothing more than empty echoes to him now, like voices heard through a closed door. Thomas, please, she murmured, her voice pleading and small, as if she still held out hope that he might soften, that he might remember the good times and forgive her somehow. But the look in his eyes told her that there would be no forgiveness, no going back to the life she had so willingly cast aside. You don't seem to understand, Lila, he said, his tone measured, holding her in place as though she were a child caught in a lie. This isn't something I can forgive. I don't believe you really understand the weight of what you've done. He paused, watching as the reality of his words struck her, the color draining from her face as she began to understand just how much she had lost. It's not about what you thought you could keep from me, he continued, each word sharp, final. It's about who you chose to become, someone who could laugh with strangers in the very home we built together, without a thought to the damage it would cause. She clutched at the edge of the couch, her fingers white with tension, searching for something, anything that might bridge the widening gulf between them. Thomas, it was never meant to be this way. I know I made mistakes, but we can try again. We can fix this. I can change. But her words seemed to drift through the air, unanswered, fading before they even reached him. He looked at her, the woman he had once thought he knew, and saw only a stranger, someone whose desires, whose choices had driven her so far from him that there was no common ground left to stand on. He took a slow breath, as if steadying himself for a final goodbye. No, Lila, he said, his tone quiet yet filled with an unyielding resolve. I've made my decision. He straightened, his gaze cool, holding her at a distance she could feel but not overcome. "I won't be a part of this anymore." She looked up at him, her face crumpling as she realized that his decision was final, that the gulf between them had become an impassable chasm. The sob she had tried to hold back spilled over, raw and desperate, as she reached for him one last time. "Thomas, please. I love you. I need you. Don't do this." But he shook his head, unmoved, his face hardening as he watched her. "Love?" he echoed, as though the word were some foreign concept she had tainted beyond recognition. "Is this what you call love, Lila? The lies, the secrets, the strangers in our home? No, whatever this is, it isn't love." She broke down fully, sinking into the cushions, her face hidden in her hands as sobs racked her body. But her grief, her sudden regret, meant nothing to him now. Thomas's resolve remained unshaken, an iron wall of conviction forged from all the quiet moments of suspicion, of wondering, of waiting for the truth that he had finally uncovered tonight. He looked down at her for a final moment, a figure broken in the ruins of the life she had shattered. "You wanted a different life, Lila," he said, his voice distant, almost reflective. "Well, you have it now." Turning, he moved towards the hallway, every step deliberate, each one taking him further from the wreckage of the past they had shared. She called his name, the sound broken, pleading, but he did not turn back. He crossed the threshold, leaving her behind, her cries fading into the distance, as he closed the door quietly behind him. As he walked away from the house, his mind was clear, his heart heavy but free, knowing that whatever waited on the other side of this moment would be one he faced on his own terms, unburdened by her betrayal. And with each step he took, he felt the final threads of their life together falling away, replaced by a quiet, unshakable peace. The cool night air hit Thomas as he stepped outside, the weight of the confrontation lifting ever so slightly with each step he put between himself and the house. The laughter, the broken promises, and the hollow apologies were behind him now, sealed away in the walls of the place he had once called home. He paused in the driveway, looking up at the windows dimly lit against the darkening sky, each one a silent witness to the life they had shared, now abandoned in favor of the unknown. The house that had once felt like a fortress of trust and warmth now loomed, a monument to something that had turned bitter and hollow. He realized with a strange, cold detachment that this was the last time he would look at it this way. It was no longer his home, but merely a place, a structure where years had been spent, where memories had gathered, yet now held nothing he wanted to hold on to. This was not a place to stay, nor was it one to return to. It had become a place for ghosts, shadows of a life that was no longer his. Thomas took a breath, feeling the stillness settle around him, a kind of calmness filling the space left by his anger. He realized how tightly he had held on to the life he had built with Lila, convinced that it was everything he needed. Yet tonight had shattered that illusion, revealing to him that the person he had trusted the most had drifted so far from him, entangled in secrets that he could never unravel and never forgive. He had loved her once, with a quiet, unshakable certainty. Walking to his car, Thomas felt a deep sense of liberation, a paradoxical lightness beneath the grief. He had chosen his path now, free of the endless questions, suspicions, and half-truths that had plagued him over the past few months. The uncertainty, the self-doubt, the quiet desperation to fix something that could not be repaired, all of it had melted away with his decision. There was a clarity in this moment that he hadn't felt in years. He got into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of leather and cologne grounding him in the present, and closed the door behind him with a finality that echoed through the quiet night. With his hands resting on the steering wheel, he let his mind drift to what lay ahead. It was a strange, uncertain road, one without Lila, without the structure of their marriage, yet there was a freedom in that blank slate, a chance to reclaim himself from the shadows of betrayal she had cast over him. Thomas started the car, pulling out of the driveway, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The memories of his life with Lila, the laughter, the shared dreams, they would fade in time, replaced by something new, something he could build without the weight of deception and lies. He realized, as he drove further from the house, that this moment was a rebirth of sorts, a chance to rediscover who he was beyond the man he had become in their marriage. He had been loyal, dedicated, unwavering in his commitment to her, yet she had taken advantage of each of those qualities. Now, he could reclaim them, use them for a purpose of his choosing. As he drove through the quiet streets, a sense of peace began to settle over him, a feeling of self-worth and strength he had nearly forgotten. He had been defined, for so long, by his role as Lila's husband, by the life they had shared. But now he was free to define himself anew, on his terms. He could explore paths he had set aside, ambitions and dreams he had sacrificed, and the friends he had let slip away as he dedicated himself to a future with her. That future was gone now, but in its place was something powerful, a life of his own making. In the silence of the car, he allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was not a smile of happiness, but of resilience, of quiet determination. He thought of all the ways he could rebuild, the new choices he could make, and the possibilities stretched before him, each one a step further from the pain he had endured. There would be difficult days ahead, no doubt, but they would be his to face alone, unburdened by the betrayal that had darkened his marriage. He drove for miles, letting the city lights fade into the distance, replaced by the open stretch of the highway under a dark, star-speckled sky. The road stretched out before him, endless and unknown, but filled with the promise of a life lived fully on his terms. The past had its place, a shadow cast in the rearview mirror, fading further with each passing mile. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to meet it, with the quiet resolve of a man who had faced the worst and walked away. As the road curved and the horizon opened up before him, Thomas felt, for the first time in a long time, the possibility of happiness, real happiness, without lies, without hidden motives, without the weight of a love betrayed. There was a world beyond the life he had known, and tonight he had taken his first step toward it.